What if the version of God you've been living with, the one you pray to, the one you bring your questions to, the one you're quietly frustrated with when things don't go the way they should, what if that version is real, but incomplete? Not wrong exactly, just missing something so fundamental that without it, everything else slightly misaligns, like a map that's accurate in every detail, except it's off by a few degrees at the start. You follow it faithfully, you trust it completely, and you still end up somewhere you didn't intend to go. That's what I want to explore, because I think there's an idea embedded deep in the book of Isaiah, an idea that most people walk right past, that changes the entire shape of how you understand God. And it's not a minor adjustment. It's more like the moment you realize the picture you've been looking at is actually a piece of a much larger image, and the part you couldn't see before is the part that gives everything else its meaning. Most people, if you ask them to describe God in a few words, would land somewhere around loving, forgiving, present, maybe powerful, and all of those things are true, genuinely, completely true. But somewhere along the way, through culture, through church, through the slow drift of familiarity, God has been quietly domesticated. He's been made approachable in a way that makes him manageable. We've built a theology that fits inside our emotional needs, and we've called it faith. We want a God who meets us where we are, which is also true, but we've quietly stopped expecting him to be anything other than what we already understand. And then something happens. A prayer goes unanswered. A tragedy arrives and doesn't leave. You read something in Scripture that doesn't fit your model, and suddenly the version of God you've been carrying feels too small for the weight of the actual world, too gentle for the brutality of real suffering, too predictable for the silence that sometimes follows your most desperate cry. That's the gap. That's where people start to drift, not because God has failed them, but because the idea of God they were given was never quite complete. This is where Isaiah comes in, not as a theological textbook, not as a doctrinal source to be mined for proof texts, but as a man who stood at the edge of something enormous and reported back on what he saw. And what he saw didn't fit any comfortable category. Isaiah chapter 6. He's in the temple, the year King Uzziah died. That detail isn't scenery, it's orientation. Uzziah had reigned for 52 years, the longest reign in Judah's recent history. He was the anchor of an era, and now he's gone. The kind of death that doesn't just end a life, but ends a world. And in that moment of national grief and political uncertainty, Isaiah sees God. Not an idea of God, not a metaphor. A vision so overwhelming that what surrounds the throne, the seraphim, whose very name in Hebrew means the burning ones, these beings who exist in the unmediated presence of God, cover their faces. They cover their faces. These are not creatures struggling with sin or distracted by fear. These are beings made for proximity to the divine, and even they cannot look directly. And they call to one another, not in a whisper, and not in reverence at a polite distance, but in a voice that shakes the physical foundations of the building. Holy, holy, holy. That word, kadosh in Hebrew, means set apart. Other. Not merely morally pure, though that's included, but categorically, essentially, incomprehensibly different from everything else that exists. When Isaiah says God is holy, he isn't giving us a compliment. He's describing an ontological reality. God is not a more powerful version of what we are. He is not on the same spectrum, just further along. He is other in a way that has no human equivalent. There is no analogy sufficient. There is no experience you can compare it to. And Isaiah's response to seeing this, A man who has presumably worshipped God his entire life, who has prayed and taught and believed. His response is not wonder. It's not peace. It's dissolution. "Woe is me," he says, "for I am undone." The Hebrew word means ruined, destroyed, coming apart at the seams. He doesn't feel small in the way you feel small when you stand next to someone impressive. He feels the wrongness of his own existence in proximity to something absolutely right. This is the missing idea. Not that God is angry, not that God is distant, but that God is holy in a way that completely reframes what it means to approach Him, to know Him, to be loved by Him. Holiness isn't a barrier to the relationship. It's the thing that makes the relationship staggering. Because here's what happens next in that vision. After Isaiah is undone, after the smoke fills the room and the threshold shakes, a seraph flies to him, not with a rebuke, with a coal from the altar, and touches his lips, and says, "So your guilt is taken away, your sin is atoned for." And then God asks, "Who will go?" And Isaiah, the man who just said, "I am coming apart," says, "Here I am. Send me." That sequence is not incidental. It's the entire shape of the gospel in miniature. Encounter the real God. Be completely undone. Be met in that undoing. Be sent. But we tend to shortcut it. We go from comfortable belief straight to being sent, and we skip the undoing entirely. And then we wonder why our faith feels thin, why it doesn't sustain the weight of actual suffering, why God feels abstract when life gets concrete. Isaiah 40 begins with, "Comfort, comfort my people." And that word, comfort, comes right after 39 chapters of judgment, right after years of warnings that went unheeded, right after the Assyrian shadow fell across the nation, and people stood in the wreckage of the world they thought they understood. The comfort of Isaiah 40 doesn't come cheap. It comes to people who have been completely stripped of every other source of security. And it says, "He will tend his flock like a shepherd. He will carry the lambs in his arms." The same God who shook the threshold in chapter 6. The same one the seraphim cannot look at. That God carries the lambs. That paradox. The God who is utterly beyond comprehension bending down to carry what is weak. That's not a contradiction to be resolved. That's the reality to be inhabited. And you can only really live in it if you hold both sides. If you lose the holiness, the tenderness becomes sentimentality. If you lose the tenderness, the holiness becomes terror. Isaiah holds them together for 66 chapters without flinching. And maybe that's where the confusion you felt makes sense. The disappointment, the prayers that felt like they dissolved before they arrived anywhere. You were praying to the tender God, which is right. But you weren't accounting for the Holy One, the one whose ways, as Isaiah 55 says, are not your ways, whose thoughts are not your thoughts. As the heavens are higher than the earth, that's the distance between His thinking and yours. Not a slight gap, not a matter of experience or wisdom you could eventually accumulate. A categorical difference, the kind that requires surrender rather than mastery. Here's what shifts when you really sit with this. The problem isn't that God has been silent or distant or slow. The problem is that you've been expecting Him to operate within a framework He never agreed to. You've been holding Him to a standard built from your own understanding of how love should behave, how power should intervene, how a good father should respond. And He's been doing something else entirely. Something that, from inside your framework, looks like absence. But from inside His is a kind of working you haven't yet developed eyes to see. Isaiah 53 describes a servant, despised and rejected, a man of suffering, acquainted with grief. No beauty, no majesty. Nothing in his appearance that would draw you to him. And yet, the weight of the passage falls here. He was pierced for transgressions that weren't his, crushed for iniquities he didn't commit. And then, in the oldest surviving manuscript of Isaiah, was written on leather in the Judean desert over 2,000 years ago, verse 11 contains a word that most readers have never heard about. The word, light. After the anguish, after the grave, he shall see light. That's not a metaphor added for comfort. That's Isaiah, writing 700 years before it happens, describing someone who goes all the way through death and emerges into something on the other side. A holiness so complete it cannot be held by a tomb. A love so undeniable it undoes even death. The God who shook the building in chapter 6, the God who carried the lambs in chapter 40, the servant in chapter 53 who saw light after being cut off from the living. This is one portrait, one coherent, staggering, unreducible God. And when you stop trying to fit him into what you already know, when you let the undoing happen, something shifts, not into easy answers, not into a faith that never struggles, but into something more durable than certainty, something more honest than comfort, into the kind of encounter Isaiah had, where you walk out of the room different, not because everything is resolved, but because you've been in the presence of the one who holds it all, and you know now, in a way you didn't before, that there's a difference between knowing about God and having seen the edges of who he actually is. That's the invitation hidden in Isaiah. Not to admire the holiness from a safe distance, to let it undo you, and then to wait for the coal, because it always comes,